Hey everyone, sorry I couldn't be there with you today, but I do want to have a conversation with you about the heart, obviously the most important muscle in our body and one of the vital organs to our very survival. To start out, we will discuss muscle tissue and the cells and the differences in muscle tissue, and then obviously go into how they relate and they're interconnected, and then we'll discuss different muscles within the heart. Just to provide a quote for a brief overview, giving you an idea of the basic level of muscle tissue, which is the cells. Cells of the larger embryonic origin and function are usually organized into larger units comprised of muscle tissue, i.e. basically the cells form together, form what we call muscle tissue. In the body there are three different types of muscle tissue. We're familiar with the cardiac muscle tissue, which is more so responsible for pumping blood through the heart. Skeletal muscle tissue, which is responsible for the locomotion and the movement of our skeletal structure. And smooth muscle tissue, which is responsible for the contraction and the vasodilation and constriction of our blood vessels. A couple of definitions I want to kind of touch on. First one being striated muscles. Striated muscle basically are the actin and myosin filaments when they're arranged in parallel bundles, which gives them a muscle fiber, a striped or striated appearance. The first muscle that I'd like to touch on that we'd like to obviously discuss would be skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is obviously the most abundant tissue, and it makes up about 40 to 45% of the total body weight. It is comprised of sarcomeres. It's used for limb and skeletal locomotion and movement. The way contraction occurs, as we've seen in the cross-bridge cycle, is the calcium binding to troponin C and revealing the binding sites. It contains a large storage of calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which I think is very, and it also has a very developed sarcoplasmic reticulum, which I think is very specific to this particular group. Smooth muscle is referred to as involuntary muscle because it triggers spontaneous contraction via the autonomic nervous system. It's slower, obviously, and has more sustained contractions than what you would see in a skeletal or cardiac muscle. The muscles are shaped like spindles, and they are smaller than skeletal muscles. Calcium, like in skeletal muscle, also initiates contraction, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum in smooth muscle is less developed than that you would see in the skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle. And first I'd like to break down the word myocardium, which is one of the muscles that we obviously see in the heart. Myo basically means muscle, and cardium means the heart. So if we go into myocardium, obviously myocardium stands for heart muscle. It's striated, very similar to what you would see in skeletal muscle, and it is composed of sarcomeres containing actin and myosin filaments, which is what you would see in skeletal muscle. It contracts like skeletal muscle, however the contractions are involuntary, as opposed to what you would see in skeletal muscle where they are voluntary, and the duration of the contractions are longer. Muscle fibers are separated by what are called intercalated discs containing desmosomes, i.e. what is also referred to as gap junctures. This allows for communication between the different muscle fibers for electrical impulses, ions, to be able to communicate with one another, because the heart is basically ran by electrical impulses. So each of these impulses are able to communicate with one another to basically sync together to provide contraction for the heart. Contraction obviously occurs with the movement of calcium across the cell membrane. It elicits an action potential, and that action potential causes muscle contraction. Relaxation occurs with the removal of calcium from the actin and myosin binding sites. Now what I have here is a comparison chart which actually shows a picture of the three different types of muscle, which you'll see in skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And what it does is it shows how each muscle is related versus the differences. As you can see with cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle, cardiac and skeletal both have striated muscle versus smooth muscle does not. This is also another interesting point to note. Cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle are, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are both innervated by the autonomic nervous system, versus skeletal muscle is innervated by the somatic nervous system. So it's two different nervous systems that are at work with these different muscle groups. Cardiac muscle cannot undergo mitotic activity to replace cells, mitotic, which basically means it cannot continue to replace damaged cells. Skeletal muscle cannot do that either. However, smooth muscle can replace cells. Cardiac muscle provides structured sarcomeres, as well as skeletal muscle provides structured sarcomeres. However, smooth muscle does not have sarcomeres. And lastly, each of these contract with an increase of calcium. Now, when we get specifically into the anatomy of the heart, obviously, as we mentioned before, consists of striated cardiac muscles, which are located on the walls of the heart. They consist of what is called the myocardium, which can be seen in the picture, but I'm not sure if it's quite clear. The intraventricular septum, the papillary muscle, the pectinate muscle, the endocardium, and the epicardium. Now, it's also important to note that there are smooth muscles that are responsible for the valves and the blood vessels that are attached to the heart, that are responsible basically for the pumping of blood into and out of the heart. Those smooth muscles consist of the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, which some of these you may be able to actually see in the graph, not in the graph, in the picture, the pulmonary artery, the pulmonary veins, the aorta, and the coronary arteries. Okay, and as you can see by the picture, some of them being blue, some of them being red, basically it's the difference between pumping out oxygenated blood versus deoxygenated blood. Obviously, deoxygenated blood being the blue and the red blood being oxygenated blood.